Good evening, class. This is a lecture that is made both for my Pellissippi State dual enrollment students at South Doyle, as well as my night class at Roane State Oak Ridge. Now, in both of the classes, we have just got done with World War II, and in the South Doyle class, we have just gotten into the 1950s. So for you guys at South Doyle, some of this is going to be review, at least for the first slide or so. Now, for most of you, we've already talked about the origins of the Cold War. So we've dealt with the macro level, the high level politics and diplomatic policies and things that brought on the Cold War. So this lecture is meant to sort of shift gears and view the Cold War in American life from a bottom-up instead of top-down viewpoint. So we're going to look at American culture and society during the 1950s and early 1960s. This lecture will be about an hour long, hopefully, and it will be posted tonight being Sunday for you guys to watch Sunday night or Monday. Be sure, both classes, be sure, there is going to be a second lecture on the 1960s to be posted on Monday night. So Monday night, early Tuesday, start looking for that lecture. So let's get into this lecture. Now, one of the big worries of both Americans in government, but also Americans in general, was that the end of World War II was going to bring on a post-war depression. Now, most wars have some economic dislocations. World War II was sort of especially hair-raising for Americans because they'd just gotten done going through the Great Depression. And was the war and the growing war economy just a fluke? Was the Great Depression going to return? Was the war going to make the Great Depression even worse? Now, why do wars oftentimes lead to economic dislocations, recessions, depressions, whatever you want to call them? Well, let's look at it this way. Wars, you're building weapons. You're building ammunition. You are funding you're funding a military operation overseas. You are not building consumer goods for the domestic population. And so, in short, there's always that transition period where factories and companies have to quit making war material and start to make consumer goods. And the question for manufacturers is, what do people want? What's the style? Is there a market for these goods, even if there was a market before the war? I mean, World War II lasted 5 years. Even before then, the U.S. economy was not that healthy. So manufacturers are asking simple questions, but these simple questions have pretty dire consequences. What should we build, and what should it look like? How do you style this? Will there be a market for this? Another problem when it comes to the end of wars is, well, the dislocation of labor forces. Because in any war, you have part of the population being recruited or drafted and being sent overseas. These are normally people who would be in the American economy making stuff, either as blue-collar or white-collar workers. In World War II, the American military population, the number of American men and to some extent women who were in the military during World War II was close to 18 million Americans between the ages of about 17 or 18 years old up to close to 40 years old. This is a huge part of the population. And these people right here are people that are going to want and need jobs. Who took their place during the war? Well, women, blacks, other minorities. If you can believe this, children as young as 14 years old worked in some factories. All of these people are not going to get to keep their jobs. Many of them are not going to get to keep their jobs. They're going to be laid off. They're going to be forced out, because this is the argument that manufacturers make. How can I deny this man who has went overseas and fought from getting his job back or getting a good job upon return? But even if you fired everybody, you're going to have a huge flood of people coming into the workforce. Now, this is one thing that the government tries to address. They do so with the GI Bill, the GI Bill of Rights that was passed in 1944, early 1945. Now, the GI Bill, as it becomes known, is basically a set of rights, a set of obligations that the government says that it will give to returning veterans who have been honorably discharged, including things like the VA, Veterans Administration, and health care. But more importantly for our discussion, GI Bill educational credits. The GI Bill promised returning veterans that they would have 3 years of fully paid schooling if they went to a 4-year college, and they'd pay for the full ride for a 2-year college, like a vocational school. Now, why are they wanting to send veterans to college? Simply put, if they're in college, if they're in school, if they're learning a trade, they're not competing with other people for jobs. They're not flooding the job market, depressing labor wages. Because not all GIs are going to take advantage of the GI Bill benefits. Some of them, for whatever reason, whether it be they have a family or they just don't want to go to school, are going to immediately seek work. The other thing that the government continues to do is to continue defense spending. Now, here is one of the ultimate ironies of World War II. While the military was scaling back, while ships that had fought in World War II were being brought home and mothballed, the older ones even being scrapped, American shipyards continued to build warships that had been laid down during the war, some of them not being completed until the late 1940s. Aircraft factories, for example, like Boeing, would continue to produce B-29 Superfortresses, while older B-29 Superfortresses were being flown out to the Arizona and Nevada desert and mothballed. And even older bombers like B-17s and B-24s were being scrapped wholesale and turned into scrap metal. Now, from just sort of a casual glance, this seems incredibly wasteful. If we have all of this war material that we won a world war with, why do we continue to need more? Well, it's not about needing more. It's about keeping those defense industry workers employed. And the other thing that helps avoid a post-war depression is what I like to call the 30-year war bubble. Because once American manufacturers start building cars and radios and furniture and Lord knows what else, one thing that you have to remember is the major competitors overseas, the Germans, the Japanese, these countries have been bombed into the Stone Age. Their industries are not going to recover till the 1960s, let alone the 1950s. The British, their industries have basically been worn out. Their factories have been run to their limit until they're literally burnt up. The British are never going to recover. Their industry is going to lag behind the world even today. It's not until the 1970s when Japan and Germany fully recover, and you see Japan producing cars, for example, like Toyotas and Nissans, until you see the emerging economies of Taiwan and South Korea starting to produce goods. You're not going to see American industry being challenged until 30 years after the war, and mainly because America sits as sort of the preeminent manufacturing country. Those competitors that even came close have either worn themselves out or we've bombed. Now, just having a good job does not satisfy Americans, because one thing that we need to discuss in order to explain the sort of the American mindset of the 1950s is, what are Americans thinking? What is their mindset? After living through a complete decade, 1929 to 1940, of the Great Depression, after living through 4.5 years of a world war, Americans are tired of social and economic and political upheaval. They're wanting the American dream. They're wanting stability. They're wanting a good job. They're wanting a family. They're wanting a home of their own. They're wanting the American dream. And part of this American dream is, of course, the family. And you have a lot of veterans who have, grown up during the Depression, fought in World War II, and you got close to 18 million men. Well, let's just be brutally honest. 18 million men in their 20s have really one thought on their mind. And they come home and they exercise this thought. And this is why those born between 1940 and the early 1960s is the largest American generation ever, the so-called baby boomer generation. And you see American families exploding. 2 to 3 kids apiece on average. That's on average. That means you have some families that are a lot more, while you have a few that, just have 1 or even none. But most families have around 2 kids. And 2 kids becomes the American ideal. Now, where do these families live? Do they go back home and live with mommy and daddy? I mean, think about this. Many American veterans who come home in 1945, they left home, and the home that they left was that of their parents. Now they have a family of their own. They're not going to live with their parents. Also, many of these people left crumbling inner cities. They're not going to want to go back and live in the urban jungle that is Chicago and New York and places like that. Instead, the American dream becomes the suburbs. Now, how do you realize the American dream of having the single family home? Well, after the war, American entrepreneurs, most notably a fellow by the name of William J. Levy, will build entire communities, like you see down here at the bottom of the page, right here. This is the very first one. It is a laid-out, engineered community called Levittown in Long Island, just off of New York. Levittown is row upon row upon row of identical houses, approximately 2 bedrooms apiece, bathroom, kitchen, dining room, and living room. Small by today's standards, but adequate for what Americans were looking for in 1946, 1947. As you can see, there's a school, probably a fire department, playing fields, everything a community needs. This is the American dream, the engineered subdivision. Because of the standardization, because these houses are nearly identical to each other, Levy was able to sell these houses for under $8,000 a pop. So a brand new home in a new neighborhood for $8,000. That's a steal. Now, another thing that happens because of World War II is that Americans move. The population center before 1929, so before the Great Depression, the population center of the United States was somewhere in the American Rust Belt. So if you put America on a scale, on a point, and balanced it where the populations were at, that point would be somewhere around Ohio. But that point starts to move south and west. Why? Well, it's because of first the Great Depression and then World War II. The Great Depression causes a lot of social dislocations. People hit the road looking for work, like the Okies moving out of Oklahoma, going to California. But it's not just them. It's not just the dislocations of the Great Depression. In World War II, factories spring up around the country. Most notably in places like Marietta, Georgia. They build B-29 bombers. Ford opens a large truck factory in Atlanta. It's still producing trucks today. Out around Los Angeles, This becomes the heart of American aviation. That's why Los Angeles booms the way it does. Los Angeles is an aircraft manufacturing town, as is Seattle, Washington. So after the war, as manufacturers are readjusting to consumer production, but also scaling back, during the war, entire factories were built just to produce bombers, just to produce tanks. After the war, some of these factories will be put into mothballs for what they call the war reserve, but the vast majority of them are going to be reconverted to peacetime production. And to put it bluntly, there are too many factories. There's too much manufacturing capacity for the economy. So if you are a business, are you going to keep the old factories using the old technology open, or are you going to keep the new factories open? It's pretty much an easy question. Those new factories, especially those built in the South where labor is cheaper, or out west, you're going to keep those factories open, and you're going to close the other factories in Camden, New Jersey, in places like Detroit and things like that. So we start to see, as early as 1946, this shift that will continue to move the American manufacturing base away from what today we call the Rust Belt. Now, what are Americans in particular? What are they desiring? Well, to understand the American mentality of the 1950s, we have to look at the genders. We have to look at American men, and we have to look at American women. Because in the 1950s, American men are going to try and recapture their title as the head of household. In the 1930s, this idea that the man was the breadwinner, he brought home the bacon, this idea that women stayed at home was upset, because when men were laid off, women had to go to work to supplement their husband's income, and sometimes they were the sole breadwinner while the husband was out of work. During the war, men went to war, and the women went to work to replace their husbands in the factory. So this idea of what it is to be an American man was thrown up in the air, basically, during this decade and a half. So in the late 1940s and the 1950s, how did American men define themselves? Did they define themselves according to the old way of American masculinity, that we were John Wayne, that American men were the guys who went out and did urban combat, as I told you guys earlier on? Or was the new American man, the new American male, something different? And I think the ideal of what the new American man is in the 1950s can best be seen as, well, what's on TV in the 1950s. Ward Cleaver, right here. This is the patriarch of the Cleaver family from Leave It to Beaver. Ward Cleaver was a man who went to a white-collar job every day, worked 8 to 5, but when he came home, he had time to advise his sons, delegate authority, and be the man of the house. He didn't just go out and bring home the bacon. Instead, he was a caring father. He was a father who was a member of social organizations like the Kiwanis. He was a Boy Scout leader. We see this in other TV shows like the Dick Van Dyke Show, Father Knows Best, numerous other shows. Now, why am I using TV as an illustration? You might be saying, well, isn't TV just reflecting the desires of Americans at the time? Well, in part, yes, but also TV is a way to shape America. That's one thing that people don't understand. TV has been used since its creation to basically mold American society. And this is the ideal that many in Hollywood believe America should be. Now, one of the things that this creates is what I like to call the men in the gray suits. It's a phenomenon in the 1940s and 1950s of the ideal man being a white-collar worker, or at least a high-paid blue-collar worker who goes to work every day in a suit and tie, in a gray, some shade of gray flannel suit. Men are not seen in public if they're not in a suit. The only time that men are not seen in suits, especially in terms of TV and other media, is when they are at home. Like, for example, here we are, the homogeneous society. We even have a man called the man in the gray flannel suit. You see here a picture with Cary Grant. Look at the men in the background. All these men in gray flannel suits. Now, what's the role of women? Well, women, their role is expanding because women have two roles now. Because women are expected to add income to the family because the family is going to need it living in a single family home and not having the combined income of the extended family. The women are also expected to be active in the community, part of the PTA, den mothers for Boy Scouts, church groups. However, first and foremost, they're supposed to be mothers and wives. They're supposed to have the house ready, so when the man comes home, dinner is ready. But because of all the labor-saving devices, the mixers, the stoves, the TV dinners that can now be popped into the oven and they're done in 45 minutes. Women don't have to spend all day cleaning house. That's the job of the vacuum cleaner. They don't have to take the rugs out and beat them anymore. They don't have to wash dishes all the time because the very first dishwashers are introduced in the 1950s. So labor-saving devices allow the women to complete their job, their traditional job of mother and wife, but at the same time free up, give them free time to expand their role. Now, one of the things that we must talk about before we get to the family as a whole, as a unit, are all women satisfied with this June Cleaver lifestyle? This is June Cleaver right down here. Well, because June Cleaver, if you look at her life, many women would say today, and many did back then, it was boring. It was damn boring. Well, for many women, it wasn't boring. My grandmother, for example, I asked her before she died, does she regret the life that she lived? And she said, no, I raised 4 kids. I took care of them. That was her creation, her accomplishment in life. However, many other women, most notably a woman by the name of Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan was from an upper middle class life. She was a woman who will be very influential in the late 50s and 1960s because she voices her dissatisfaction and that of other women around her in a very influential book called The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique talks about how women are not only bored, but they feel dissatisfied, that they're not accomplishing anything, that they feel trapped, depressed in their lives in the 1950s. And that if they try and break out of this, it's not just their husbands who are not supportive of, say, them going and finding a job outside the home, but other women. If you've ever seen the movie Mona Lisa's Smile, Mona Lisa's Smile, of course, has Julia Roberts playing a single teacher at a private girls' school. And she sort of teaches outside the box, expects her female students to be something outside the norm. And, of course, her main antagonists are not the male teachers. It is the mother of one of her students. Because in the 1950s, Americans become obsessed with order to some degree. Stability is something that is constantly on the mind of Americans. Because if you look at the Cleaver family here from Leave It to Beaver, if we look at the Cleaver family here, Ward Cleaver, the sober, caring, frugal patriarch of the family. June, the mother who penny pinches, who makes every dollar go the farthest, who always dresses smartly, always has dinner on the table, but always finds time to do things outside of outside of the home. You have Wally, the older brother, the responsible brother, the brother who is always keeping his younger brother, the Beaver here, in check. Whereas the Beaver is, always getting into trouble, but it's always innocent trouble. He's never purposely meaning to get into trouble. Because this is the American ideal. This is why Leave It to Beaver is such a popular TV show, because Americans strive to learn from it and imitate this TV show. And many parents, of course, are new parents during the late 40s and early 1950s, and in order to create and have these perfect children, they seek advice. And many of them will go to, of course, baby handbooks. And one of the most influential baby handbooks is written by Dr. Benjamin Spock. This is a book right here, Baby and Child Care, published in the late 1940s. Now, when I say Dr. Benjamin Spock, I'm talking about this man right here, not Mr. Spock from Star Trek. Now, what is so influential about Dr. Spock's child care philosophy? Well, Dr. Spock argues that all children are individuals. Because before the Great Depression, before World War I especially, discipline was seen as the key to raising good, healthy children. Spare the rod, spoil the child was sort of the operating principle before the Great Depression and World War II. However, after World War II, Spock tells parents to let their child express themselves. Let them be an individual. Consider them to not be the same as other children. Now, this is quite ironic in that this is a baby manual, in effect. A standardized manual for raising children, telling parents that all children are different. Now, that's one of the ironies. One of the controversies around Dr. Spock's book is that in telling parents to let their children express themselves, some social critics today argue that Spock opened the doorway for the 1960s counterculture, in that 1950s parents indulged their children a little too much, that the baby boom generation was not only a generation of affluence, meaning that they had everything that they ever needed, that they never had to want like their parents did in the 1930s. Not only did they grow up in affluence, but they were given everything without having to earn it, and thus they didn't know what sacrifice was. And this is one of the criticisms of the baby boom generation, and they level this, of course, at Dr. Spock's feet. Now, the 1950s is often known as a conformist society, a homogeneous society. When people look back on the 1950s, we basically think of, well, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, Dick Van Dyke. These shows on TV are almost cookie cutter in terms of their characters, and there's a reason why they are cookie cutter. Americans were becoming very much alike in the 1950s. Why? Well, some would argue that this was imposed upon Americans, that opinion makers and even the government stressed this idea of men in the gray suits, women in their dresses, always dressed up even when they're cooking, and that this was sort of engineered. But this avoids one major cause of this conformity. Americans had lived through two very disruptive periods in human history, the Great Depression and World War II. They hungered for stability. They hungered for some form of order in their lives. And this order comes in the form of a new national culture, a culture that is born out of these adversities, because Americans, after being denied good jobs, after being denied homes, after being thrown out of jobs, having the economy wrecked, they have the same dream of stability, single-family homes, good, loving family, all of these things that are epitomized by shows like Leave It to Beaver. They have similar dreams born of similar experiences, and they have similar fears. They have similar fears of a return of depression, similar fears of expanding communism, similar fears of nuclear war. And we see these similarities being, well, helping, they're helped, these similarities are helped to be and fostered by the very events that Americans are trying to avoid. World War II in particular. When American men are drafted or volunteer for service, you don't see, like in the Civil War, where units are raised, like the 54th Massachusetts or the 13th Georgia. The 3rd Infantry Division, the unit my grandfather fought in, or one of my grandfathers fought in, this unit had people from all over the country. And Americans were introduced to other Americans. And they were able to get to know other Americans and see that other Americans, while they were a little bit different, had the same hopes and desires, and that this similarity will follow through into the post-war period. Now, what about class differences? This has been one of the major dividing points in American history. White-collar workers tend to be better paid. They don't have the same dangerous jobs as blue-collar workers, but after the war, because of the 30-year war bubble, blue-collar workers are getting paid more than they ever dreamed of. After World War II, you won't see the damaging strikes that Americans had before World War II. I'm not saying that there won't be strikes, but you don't see the industrial war that we talked about earlier in class. And because blue-collar workers and white-collar workers are getting paid comparable amounts of money, and because they have the similar desire to have the single-family home in these new suburbs like Levittown, they're going to move. They're going to buy a house, and they're going to live right next to each other. They're going to drive similar cars. So they're going to view themselves as, well, we're just the same. Bob here works as a welder or a sheet metal press at the local car manufacturing plant. Well, I work at Saginaw Steering as the accountant who makes sure that the money's coming in on time. So while American blue-collar workers win benefits, so labor, small L labor, wins because of better pay, benefits, and these things that companies can afford to give them because the economy is going so great. It also means that the unions, big L labor, loses out. Because why do you need to be a member of a union if the company's giving you 80% of what you really would like to see happen? They're giving you good pay, they're giving you health benefits, they're giving you retirement, they're giving you all these things. Well, I don't need to be a member of the union. And so you see union membership start to decline in the 1950s, and this is one reason why in 1950 union membership was about 70% of the American manufacturing blue-collar workforce. Today, it's under 20%. So union membership has declined precipitously in this country. Now, this doesn't mean that this homogeneous society that many people saw on the surface illustrates America overall, because bubbling beneath the surface, bubbling within the very families like the Cleavers, you see tension, you see rebellion, you see angst. Now, one of the groups that is going to be predominant in this rebellion is, of course, young baby boomers themselves. The very kids that the World War II generation is going to have after the war. So starting in the 1950s and going into the 1960s, you're going to see children that were born in the early 40s and immediately after World War II come of age. And when I say come of age, I mean they're teenagers. And like most teenagers, they're trying to define themselves. And it's really interesting because In the 1950s, you have a full-fledged teen culture. Now, there was youth culture before even World War I, but in the 1950s, for the first time in American history, you have a teen culture. I mean, think about it. TV has marketed to the baby boom generation because they were the largest generation ever since they were born. That's why today most television commercials that are not trying to sell you a cell phone are trying to sell you retirement insurance. This generation is going to be influential, and one of the first things that is important to understand about this generation is they don't want to be their parents. In creating their culture, they have to define themselves. And this, of course, creates what in the 1990s we called angst. Teen angst. Basically, what teen angst is, as defined by Nirvana, the band, is this idea of not wanting to be your parents, not liking the world around you, but not really knowing what to replace it with. So what do teenagers replace it with? They replace it with new styles, but more importantly, they replace it with music. Music becomes sort of the defining element of the 1950s. Rock and roll is born from a mixture of jazz, blues, rockabilly, all coming together. Rock and roll is a truly interracial, multiracial genre of music, because if you look at the progenitors, the people who helped create rock and roll, you have black musicians like Little Richard and, more importantly, Chuck Berry. But you have white musicians like Buddy Holly and Elvis Presley. Many black musicians today criticize Elvis as stealing black music and making money off of it. But that's what music is. Music is taking from one genre and making it your own. Or, if all you have to do is look at, Puff Daddy. And what Elvis did, this is the importance of Elvis and Buddy Holly, is you have white musicians, white singers, taking traditionally black music, combining it with white music, namely bluegrass and rockabilly, and coming up with a new genre, rock and roll, a genre that the teens of the 1950s could call their own. Now, one of the problems I have with this idea of teen rebellion in the 1950s is, on the one side, it is a grassroots rebellion, as teens sort of try and find themselves. But in a lot of ways, it's manufactured rebellion. It is rebellion that is created by the very establishment the teens are rebelling against. Hollywood, how much more establishment can you get? Hollywood will cash in on this teen rebellion with movies like Rebel Without a Cause. Rebel Without a Cause is all about teen angst. James Dean, doesn't like the household that he lives in. He doesn't like, he doesn't like the fact that his father, who, is no longer a man. Yes, he goes to work every day and brings home the bacon, but in this case, he's rebelling against the idea of the Ward Cleaver that's all soft, touchy-feely, if you will. Instead, Hollywood starts to promote the bad boy image. Now, James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause really isn't a bad boy. He's just misunderstood. However, other actors, and I don't have it in my notes, so let me look on my other computer here and I can give you a good example. Other actors are going to fill in the bad boy image. More importantly, most importantly, it's going to be actors like, let's see here. Hold on a minute. Yeah, Marlon Brando. There's a great movie from the 1950s, if I can find it really quick. The Wild One, 1953. Brando plays a motorcycle gang leader, leather jacket, chopperized Harley. It's going to be the bad boy image that is promoted by Hollywood, and this can be seen in merchandising. Blue jeans become popular, leather jackets become popular, wife beater white t-shirts become popular, cigarettes become popular in the 1950s. In the 1950s, you're not a man unless you smoke. So in a lot of ways, this teen rebellion of the 1950s, you really can't say that it is true rebellion, because first, they don't know what they're rebelling for. They know what they're rebelling against, but they don't have any replacement for what they're rebelling against. And secondly, in some ways, teens are being led in this rebellion by the very institutions that they're rebelling against. However, there is another group that is truly more rebellious, if you will, and radical in the 1950s. These are the so-called beatniks of the Beat generation. Who are the beatniks? Well, the beatniks are alienated young Americans in their 20s and early 30s. Some even are old enough to be considered, quote, World War II generation. One of the most notable ones is a man by the name of Jack Kerouac. Kerouac served in the U.S. Navy, I believe, for 1 year at the end of World War II, came back. And in the late 1940s, his experiences sort of typify the beatnik mindset, because Kerouac did not want to be the man in the gray suit. He didn't want to go to college and then get a job and then work 8 to 5 and come home to a single family home that the home looks like every other house in the neighborhood. Instead, he bummed around the country, took notes and wrote small little stories about racism in the South and class differences that still were problems in the country. And then when he got done, he put this down into sort of a magna opus, if you will. It becomes sort of the Bible of the Beat generation and the precursor to the counterculture of the 1960s. Because this book that is appropriately named On the Road is part fiction, part fact, of Kerouac telling a story of his view of America. And it's a view that he particularly does not like. Instead, the Beat generation wanted a less materialistic society. A society not based on acquisition of things, but instead a society based on having fun, on enjoying oneself and living in the moment. For this reason, the beatniks tended to focus on music and art. They tended to be drug abusers. They're the ones that introduced the use of marijuana on a large scale, because it's all about living in the moment. And of course, this is going to have a great effect on the emerging baby boomers, especially when we get into the 1960s. Now, there's some other tensions bubbling under the surface in the 1950s and exploding at several different points, popping up, but mainly in the South. And this, of course, has to do with black Americans and the birth of the civil rights movement. Many historians and even students have asked the question, why did the civil rights movement start when it did? Why did it start in the 1950s? Why didn't it start in the Great Depression when society was all coming apart? Why couldn't blacks take advantage of that? Why the 1950s? Well, first, blacks made several gains during the war. You got 18 million American men, mainly white men, going off to war. That leaves openings in good manufacturing jobs for blacks to enter and, get a job. But also, you have blacks serving in the military. Blacks originally served in segregated units, but as the war progressed, many blacks would see combat. First in segregated units like the Tuskegee Airmen, who flew fighters, and also independent combat engineering battalions, and even a tank unit. But after the Battle of the Bulge, the need for replacement, basically warm bodies to replace losses during the Battle of the Bulge, caused leaders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower to order rear echelon troops, including black units, to be scavenged for anybody that could be spared and be sent to the front. So by just de facto need, segregation was done away with, at least temporarily, in the military. Now, after the war, many blacks who have either served or they saw what was going on over in Europe are not going to willingly stand by and put up with the racism of that permeated this country. They're not going to put up with Jim Crow in the South, and they're not going to put up with racism in the North. They've seen what racial thought, the ultimate logical outcome of racial thought, comes to when it comes to Nazi Germany and the camps. And many blacks argue that, well, we're living in our own kind of totalitarian state here, especially in the South. And it's not just blacks who are making this decision. Many whites come to the same conclusion. And this is important because civil rights would not have been successful if it was just up to the blacks alone. For the blacks to win, they have to gain the support of mainstream white America. And we see this first in the courts. The National Organization for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization set up in the late 1800s to basically fight racism in the post-Civil War South especially. The NAACP is going to take several key cases to the Supreme Court of the United States. Two are important to our discussion. The first is Morgan v. Virginia. In Morgan v. Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that anybody, including private businesses, that make their living from interstate commerce cannot discriminate against black Americans. So not only would this include bus lines that drive across state lines, but also motels, because this had to do with motel lodging on the border of Virginia and Maryland. Now, what's the rationale for the Supreme Court to say that they can't discriminate? According to the Constitution, according to the Supreme Court, the Constitution gives the federal government the right to regulate interstate commerce. Under the power to regulate interstate commerce, the court says the federal government has the right to state anybody involved in interstate commerce cannot discriminate against black Americans. Now, this doesn't mean immediately we're going to see desegregation. It takes time. Just like in one of the most momentous Supreme Court decisions of the Civil Rights era, and this is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. Because in Brown versus Board, the Supreme Court overturns itself. Because in the 1890s, the Supreme Court, under, of course, different judges, ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that as long as blacks had the same access to black facilities that whites had to white facilities, you could have separate but equal facilities. This is why you had white water fountains and black water fountains. This is why you had black bathrooms and white bathrooms. This is why whites sat in the front of the bus, blacks sat in the back of the bus. This is why you had white schools and black schools. However, historically, the black schools were worse than the white schools. And this is what Brown v. Board was all about. Because in 1954, this Supreme Court ruled that being separate, in effect, makes them unequal. There's no way for them to be separate and being equal at the same time. Thus, the Supreme Court says that if any institution is receiving federal money, they cannot discriminate. This is the court case that starts integration. Of course, this doesn't mean that the opponents of integration, that the segregationists are going to say, well, we lost, and they're going to start integrating schools and whatever. They fight. And of course, the civil rights movement fights back. Now, one way that integrationists fight back is to take matters into their own hands. In the case of interstate commerce, we see this with the Freedom Riders. A whole organization, actually two organizations, are created to facilitate and organize these freedom rides. What are the freedom rides first? The freedom rides are where blacks and sympathetic whites will board a bus in the north where they don't have to sit in separate parts of the bus, say for example Philadelphia, PA, and buy bus tickets to Birmingham, Alabama or Jackson, Mississippi. Now, if you had done this before, these buses would stop at the state line. State troopers or local police would get on board the bus, and if blacks were sitting with whites or whites were sitting in the back with blacks, they would tell them whites to the front, blacks to the back. Well, the members, these Freedom Riders as they become known, basically make it a point to advertise they are not going to segregate. They're going to stay in mixed company. And the organizations that help organize this are the Congress on Racial Equality, acronym of CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. Now, again, this doesn't mean that they win immediately, because many of these freedom riders, when they cross over into states like Alabama and Mississippi, the buses are stopped, and when they refuse to segregate, they're arrested. Sometimes they're taken outside the bus and beat up. Sometimes, as you can see from this photo right here, they're beat up in the bus station. At one point in Jackson, Mississippi, I believe, a mob gathered outside and threatened to lynch all of the Freedom Riders. But this is where Morgan v. Virginia comes in, because this is all televised, because one of the things that SNCC and CORE do is advertise. They publicize their plight, their mission, what they're doing. And when this is published in papers around the country, the furor that this creates causes the federal government to act, and acting upon the authority given to it via Morgan v. Virginia, because what happens is federal marshals are put on the buses to secure these freedom riders, to basically tell, hey, local authorities, we're not going to allow you to do this, and we're not going to allow, non-government, basically like the Klan, non-government organizations to do it for you either. Because one of the things that is important for you guys to understand is this: the civil rights movement is less about the Klan versus the government. It's about the government versus the government. Now, we see another major issue, another major event in terms of civil rights concerning busing in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks. One of the things that I must do is kind of demystify Rosa Parks. I'm not going to try and take anything away from the woman, but she was just not an innocent bystander. Rosa Parks was active in the Montgomery civil rights movement. And so she was already of the mindset of not wanting to, put up with this BS. So one day in 1956, she is riding a bus, and she's riding in the middle of the bus. Now, what happens is if more whites get on board, the line separating blacks and whites can be pushed back. Well, more whites got on board, and Rosa Parks was sitting in on that line, and the bus driver told her to get up and go to a seat in the back. Well, she refused. Well, the bus driver called the cops. The cops came in and ordered her to the back of the bus. She refused. She was arrested. She was put in jail. In response to the jailing of Rosa Parks, the black population of Montgomery, which is a large percentage of the population of Montgomery, Alabama, boycotts the private bus line. This was not a public bus line. This was a private bus line, and it was for profit. That means that, when you boycott it, you're not paying bus fare anymore. So how did these civil rights workers, how did these black Montgomeryans get around? Well, they started doing things like, carpooling. They started walking. Now, in any sane world, the bus company would have went and said, okay, we're not going to follow segregation anymore. But the problem that you guys have to remember is, in many ways, they had to, because segregation was codified in law. So what do they do instead? They go to the government, the local government, the city government, and they say, you guys have got to help us. We're being run out of business. And so the city of Montgomery passes laws like, for example, you can't have more than 2 people in your car. Now, what if you that's a stupid law. You've got a big LTD that can hold 6 people. Well, it's your car. You should be able to carry, as many people as you want. But the government came up with some lame excuse, and to tell you the truth, I can't remember what it was. But it said it had something to do with safety. It was aimed not at safety. It was aimed at breaking this boycott. But during this boycott, the civil rights movement is going to gain its most influential voice. Because during this bus boycott, the civil rights movement of Montgomery, these bus boycotters, understand that they have to get white America to understand their cause. If they allow themselves to be silent, if they allow the government just to tell people, well, we're doing this because of safety, well, white Americans are going to buy it, and they're going to say, well, these people are just doing stuff that's unsafe. That's why they need to be put in their place. Well, they need a spokesman. And they turn to a relatively young pastor from Alabama. This, of course, is Martin Luther King. Now, why does King become the leader of the civil rights movement, especially in the latter half of the 1950s? Well, it has everything to do with the fact that in order to win white America, black America had to make white America sort of sympathize with them, to feel like kindred spirits, to break that color line. King was a pastor, a man of God. He was also educated, well-spoken, and let's not mince matters here. He was also lighter skinned than many blacks. Because there were other leaders, like Robert Abernathy. This was a man who basically started the bus boycott. He's the father of this bus boycott. But he sees that King is a better spokesman because he can pull white America, at least some of white America, to the side of black America. Now, the uneasy peace. Now, that's one thing we have to remember. Because in the 1950s, the civil rights movement, teen rebellion, the rebellion of groups like the Beatniks does not make a whole lot of sense, or it kind of seems stuff happening here and happening there. To pull it all together, we have to understand that this is occurring during a time when Americans desperately want normalcy. They desperately want stability. And so, as Americans want a stable political life, that's why they liked Ike. Eisenhower came in 1952. He promised to get us out of Korea. He did in 1953. He presided over a decade of economic prosperity unseen in American history. And he didn't rock the boat. Ike didn't propose major political changes or social changes. Ike, for his part, didn't support segregation, but didn't attack it. Because Americans weren't seeking to see radical change. Instead, Americans were seeking pleasure. Americans were seeking to have a life, and they shunned anything that seemed to disrupt that. This is why they shunned people of difference. This is why Americans shunned people of different colors. This is why they didn't want to have major political or social or economic debates. Because those that were different could hurt the country. Disunity, disorder could make America weak. And the 1950s was the decade of the height of the Cold War, or at least one of the hot points of the Cold War. It's during the 1950s that Americans feared nuclear annihilation. So, this is why in the 1950s, Americans built bomb shelters at a record pace. This is why many houses built during this time period have either bomb shelters built into the basement or separate bomb shelters out in the backyard. This is the time period of Bert the Turtle. The turtle that advised kids to duck and cover, to avoid being caught by the bomb. Now, if you watch these videos, and you guys can get on YouTube and just type in Bert the Turtle, B-E-R-T the Turtle, or duck and cover, and you can see how ridiculous these advisements to children are. With your own knowledge of what happened during the Cold War, or what would happen in the case of nuclear war, that jumping down into a gutter or a drainage ditch and covering your head is not going to keep you from being vaporized by a nuclear explosion. Because this was the decade where people feared nuclear war. Even more than the 1960s. This idea that American society could disappear in a flash was on Americans' minds. It was official government policy. One reason why Eisenhower was such a popular president is he kept us out of various wars around the world. And one way that he did this was to make pretty much a threat to the Soviets. Under Eisenhower, American foreign policy centered around a policy known as massive retaliation. In short, if the Soviets did anything directly or indirectly to harm the United States would take this as a nuclear strike and strike back with our full atomic arsenal. This is not lost on Americans. It's not lost in the fact that the American government and their Soviet counterparts have their finger itching on the trigger is not lost on Americans. And we see this paranoia be illustrated in some of the most benign places, like, for example, the space race. Something that should have brought joy and optimism to the world. The fact that that the world, including the United States, was about to break the bonds of this earth and explore the universe, should have made people kind of feel like they were on Star Trek. Instead, it made people even more paranoid. Because the space race at its heart was a military race. The very same rockets that shot Sputnik, the first satellite, a Soviet satellite, into orbit, the very same rockets that put John Glenn into orbit, the first American to circle the Earth, were the same rockets that were designed to carry the first nuclear missile, the first nuclear warheads. These were the rockets to become the first intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. And so the space race was intimately linked with the nuclear arms race. Now, next class period, or I should say not next class period, but the next lecture that will be posted on Monday night, we will jump into the early 1960s. We'll talk about the Kennedy era. We'll talk about the Great Society. We'll talk about this idea that the government should play an active role in American society, and what that means for American politics and American culture. And we'll also try and get into Vietnam. Now, that lecture will be considerably longer, probably somewhere around an hour and a half. This lecture is actually winding up to be under an hour. So watch this and prepare for the lecture on the 1960s. And for the Roane State class, we will try and clean up as much as we can before we have our midterm study session. And for the South Doyle guys and girls, we will continue on to the 1970s and 1980s next class period and the class period after that. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.